for the gentleman who asked the question of where you make money, and Alok gave us thing, I would ask you to join the panel the talk I'm giving at 5 about scaling up the Indian IoT thing. And actually, I say that's the wrong question, but we will take it in that session. Thanks a lot for that. When we were planning this, IVK, who's helping us, and he's granted, he's also single-handedly runs the CIA Innovation Summit. He had some interesting ideas and questions. So this topic about whether we are controlling things is very interesting. So if you remember, when calculators came, people were worried. People are losing the ability to do mathematical reasoning. And with Google, you don't remember any facts. You just Google it. So encyclopedia and all that. So the question is, as technology comes, how does it change us? Now we have so many devices, Siri, Google Assistant, and all these handling us. What does it mean? And there are two ways of framing it. There are some people who worry, and that is always true. And there are some people who are optimistic. I belong to the optimistic camp. We have 20 servants. Even the king in old days did not have so many digital servants helping them. So we are going to have a fantastic humanity in Indian mythology. Kali Yuga is gone, Treta Yuga is coming. So with that preface, I would like to invite IVK. We call him IVK, and come on the stage. And IVK will explore this topic with Dr. Pawan Mamidi, and that's a very interesting background. He has a technological background, but he runs the Center for Experimental Social Sciences, which is a collaboration with NUFID, which is a UK thing, and NUFID, and Flame University, which is in Pune. Off you go, sir. You have to say. One more. Is it someone was talking?
Can you hear me? Yeah, good afternoon. There is no time break in the sessions, but this is a semantic break. So we will focus on the right brain side of IoT, not the left brain side of IoT. I have Dr. Pawan Mamidi to chat with me, and I'm going to put him some interesting questions, seeing from a human perspective, not from device perspective. Dr. Pawan is trained as a mathematician, holds a PhD in social sciences from Oxford, and a law degree from Harvard Law School, and runs an experimental social sciences lab in Flame University in Pune. With that, let me set the context. Given the theme is IoT, but I framed the questions in a slightly different perspective on how humans react to devices, and perhaps there are some learnings for us. Just to give you some kind of a technical and a systems context before I get into the behavioral side. I want to make 3 points. We live in a connected society. I think that is given. Not just with people, but with things which think. Second, not just local but global. Not just physical but also virtual. That is how I characterize the connected society in simple terms. There are 3 significant tech trends. There are many, but I will just stick to 3. AI and ML, I put them together, replaces human effort most of the time. Blockchain, surprisingly, substitutes human trust. Unbelievable, right? IoT, perhaps substitutes our decision making. What are we then? The third one is a change in vantage point, and that is what this session is all about. We have taken the view of systems. Most of us, I hope, are trained as engineers or think from a left brain thinking. We want you to shift to right brain and look at some questions here. From tech systems viewpoint to social systems viewpoint, to use a technical term, being a technologist, from a point of view of a node to a point of view of a person. So I'll start my first question to Dr. Pawan. We often heard the term context in most of our systems, including IoT. To put it more generally, situational awareness, a slightly more lighter term than context. What does context or situational awareness mean in a connected society with devices?
Thank you, IVK. Can you hear me? Is this working? Yeah. It's such a pleasure to be here. And at the very outset, I'd like to start with a caveat emptor. And I'm not a technologist, but I approach technology as a close to as an interested onlooker. I have a background in social sciences, and we do experimental work on behavioral decision making, which implicates behavioral economics. I want to approach your first query by using two examples. The first one is drawn from the world of behavioral economics, and this is something that Dan really talks about. And this, in some sense, connects with the broader idea of how we adopt technology. This example relates to the alarm clock. I mean, generations of students in the world over party late into the night, and but they have to wake up in the morning for an examination. So they set their alarm clock on, and in the morning, they're a different person. Every individual is constituted of multiple selves. What we are in the evening, we are not in the morning. And they turn the alarm clock off and they go back to bed. And there's a very interesting design solution which sort of responds to this behavioral feature, this anomaly of a rational choice person that we seem to have constructed. And this is a sort of a design idea of an alarm clock which is connected to the internet, but which is also sort of, in some sense, connected to your bank account. And if you do not wake up in the morning, what it does is it transfers a little bit of your money to a political party that you hate. It's a commitment device, and we seem to need this commitment. It's a brilliant idea. Why is it a brilliant design idea? Because it anticipates what is considered to be a deeply rational way of behaving from a sort of a neoclassical economic point of view. And this is called the time inconsistency problem. And there are two conceivable ways in which we can discount future value. And the first one is the exponential. For those of you who are mathematically inclined, f of t equals e to the power of minus kt, and that sort of, it's a symmetric sort of a curve. But the irrational way of behavior is really what we observe in the real world. And the mathematical model that has been discovered through empirical work is the hyperbolic discounting model, where the rate at which the value of something comes down is far more dramatic. So here we're talking about it's IoT, it's an alarm clock that's connected, but it anticipates what we ordinarily consider to be irrational behavior. The second example that I want to put forward is an example from ethical philosophy. This is something that Michael Sandel at Harvard talks about in his lectures on justice. And it's popularly called the trolley problem. And the trolley problem is constructed in the following manner. Imagine, if you will, that you are standing beside a lever and you observe a trolley hurtling down the tracks, and it can kill 4 people. And you have the opportunity of switching the lever, which will direct the trolley in a different direction, which will kill only 1 person. Which choice would you, what is the choice that you would make? Would you avoid killing the 4 people and kill only 1 person? Yes? That's typically the answer that you would receive from a sample of subjects. And this method of anticipating a decision is the utilitarian method, where you're trying to maximize the happiness of the many, even if it costs by way of killing 1 person. Imagine this very same problem posed in an structurally identical manner in a different setting. Imagine, if you will, that you're sitting in a hospital and there are 4 people in different rooms, and each one is going to die of an organ failure, one of a heart, the other of a liver, and so on and so forth. And in walks a guy, a perfectly normal patient, who's sitting in the waiting room, and the doctor basically decides to take him into another room and harvest his organs and save the 4 people. How might you react to this situation? Now here, in the second example, the sample of subjects, I mean, in an experimental setting would say, no, 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 we will not do that. Why? Because there are certain kinds of emotions that are invoked. There's a deontological view of our human worth, and we will not do that. Identical. Your utilitarianism fails, right? Now, how is this discussion about the conflict between a utilitarian efficiency approach and deontological, a rights-based approach, relevant to our discussion on adoption of technology? Think about your driverless car. If a driver, I mean, you need to hardwire the driverless car to anticipate potential situations where they have to make a choice between killing 4 people versus killing the person sitting in the car. And by corporate obligation and by legal obligations, the company that hardwires these cars is responsible for its consumers. How might the car company now respond to such an anticipated situation? It's not an easy question to answer. It's a philosophical question. And it's at the boundary between our attempt to pursue greater and greater utilitarian efficiency and the boundary where we do not have easy answers and where we start going into human value, human worth, and so on and so forth. So I approach this whole discussion about artificial intelligence, particularly the use of the word intelligence in AI, seems to be much more aspirational rather than a real state of affairs right now. Until we sort of get to that stage where we can answer some really difficult questions about human behavior, particularly human irrationality, I do not believe that we are entitled to saying that we really have AI. We have extreme automation. I mean, even a bimetallic strip which controls your thermostat, I mean, those of you who have done physics in high school will know, was also a form of AI in some sense. So that's the sort of, the initial sort of...
Thank you, Pawan. I think you covered what you call the logical dilemma and the ethical dilemma. What about the emotional context? Do you have any example for that?
I mean, if I were a driver sitting in a car and I were implicated, I mean, I'll give you the example of this Amtrak, this great Amtrak accident, where this woman who was sitting in the car sued the Amtrak company because she said, I mean, it killed a bunch of people. She sued the Amtrak company saying that it subjected me to the emotional trauma of having contributed to the weight of the train, which killed those 4 people. So, I mean, technology cuts in multiple ways, and anticipating the different ways in which you can impact human behavior, I think needs to be discussed more.
So we'll shift gears to another famous question, which is mostly philosophical and maybe academic, but nevertheless impacts us as a society. What is the impact you see on comprehension? In other words, the way we learn and the way we apply knowledge. If everything is done by devices on their own, and we don't have to make many decisions, even if you make a few, what about inspiration? What about motivation? So how does it impact a class of 2030 in Harvard?
That's a
The
great
general view is that the general intelligence will be there in AI, in machines by 2025, between 2025 and 2030. So will it change the way we learn? Will it change the way we apply knowledge? Or what does knowledge mean at all?
That's a great question, IVK. And from my own personal experience, let me tell you a little about how I used to look for books in the Usmania University library once upon a time. I'd walk into the library, there would be a wooden catalog box through which I'd sort of rife through the cards, go into the stacks and actually look for a book. And in doing so, I would go through multiple stacks. And I was able to make connections between disparate fields. But now we seem to have outsourced the agency of that search to Google. And while on one hand it has reduced your sort of cognitive load in discovering information, have we in some sense disabled our ability to make connections? That's one of the key things that I think we need to understand. The second thing is, we are in some sense abnegating our sense of agency. We become less of ourselves. I mean, it's no more me doing it, but it's somebody else or some other entity that is discovering the process of discovering the new information. And an empirical evidence points to one of the key features of creativity, and that is peer group reputation. When I discover a new thing, I want to be known as the person who has discovered it. So in some sense, my individual identity then becomes an important thing. And if my individual identity in this new world that we are creating gets submerged to the agency that we have created, then we may be in some sense disabling the very fuel of the process of discovery and creativity. So I think I'm not a pessimist about IoT. All that I'm saying is maybe we also need to think about what it does to human agency and our self-worth in evaluating the adoption of IoT as a form of technology. Because history of adoption of technology is replete with examples of highly efficient forms of technology which have fallen down the cracks. I mean, take your classic example of Betamax versus VHS. Betamax was considered to be vastly superior to VHS, and yet it never got adopted. Right? Or the adoption of the mop in your households, in your Indian households. The mop is far, far more efficient than this servant that you employ who goes down on her haunches to clean your floor. It's like 8 times more efficient. And yet there are a variety of social factors which lead to, not adopting that new technology. Yeah.
An interesting data point. For most of us, the point of insight is also the point of judgment. But in complex systems, sometimes they don't mean the same thing. If you're a pilot, when things are really complex or you hit a turbulence, you get back the control. So is the case of scheduling hazardous gases in routing. So any complex problem at scale, the algo or the machine presents 3-4 choices and the human makes a judgment. The concern many of us have in IoT systems is they're completely autonomous or self-healing in that sense. It is perfectly fine if you remove the utilitarian load on you so that we don't have to set the thermostat ourselves. But you do worry if the machines start making judgments on your surgery, for example. Do they assist or do they substitute you? Now, I'm not playing the role of a technologist here, so that will be a different debate. But it now gets back to the other question, which is an adjacent question to knowledge, the level of control. So, advancements in level of control, does it mean that we lose the humanism? It's both the first mile problem and the last mile problem. First mile problem with respect to policy. How much control you should allow for systems to manage themselves? It's actually a policy challenge. How do you develop or regulate a connected society? Both positive and negative. The lower end of the problem or the last mile problem is amount of automation so that you don't do things which are not required to be done by humans. Now, this also begets a question a little more philosophical. What kind of society you want? In fact, I heard the previous panel. I used to be on the external advisory on the Tata Group's smart city discussions and smart transport. It's the same argument we had. What is the city you want to build and for whom? What is smart about it? Infrastructure? Well, so if you see it from a sociologist's perspective, the answers might be very different. So I think the same question applies to a lot of other sectors here in IoT. What is the level of control we are comfortable with? Or what will we give up? Any perspectives from you from a sociologist's perspective?
If one were to ask this question about control, if you were to ask a neuroscientist these days, I mean, they're going to a discussion about the debate between free will and determinism. There's this view that everything is determined, but there are people who would like to believe that we have autonomy, we have choice, and so on and so forth. But neuroscientists are trying to tell us that we are also determined. We don't really have control, but we just sort of suffer from the delusion of control. Maybe AI has less of that delusion of control, and maybe we have a greater amount of the delusion of control. But having said that, even if it is a delusion of free will, or even if it is a delusion of control that we have, I think it's a necessary delusion. And I think when you develop technological systems, you've got to continue to maintain that delusion of control among the users of technology. If you paralyze that delusion of control, or the sense that people have that they have control over their environment, then I think you'll be paralyzing their humanness in some sense. And that can be fairly dangerous. So even if you create the most wonderfully efficient utilitarian infrastructure that's going to populate our, our lives as we go forward, I think it is important to try and incorporate that element which is going to tell individuals that they are valuable, that they still have some choice. Otherwise, we risk, for instance, I mean, if you were to look at implications on crime, I mean, you can't construct the concept of crime in society legally unless you have intentionality. You can't say that somebody is blameworthy unless you can attribute intention. It's called mens rea in Latin. And if you're going to go to this extreme situation where, you say we don't have control on ourselves, then anybody can turn around and say it's not out of any moral turpitude that I have committed this particular bad thing, but I was in some sense coerced to do it. So, in order to rescue blameworthiness, in order to rescue creativity, in order to rescue human agency, I think it is very, very important to preserve and cherish the delusion of self-control that we have in society.
In lighter vein, I should say that crime is normally evaluated in terms of capability, opportunity, and motivation. Hopefully, only the motivation is still human. So now we'll come to something more ground level. Because there are many IoT startups here, and even the corporates who pursue IoT as a business line, from a social sciences perspective or a social research perspective, what are your views on what changes are required in, say, UX design, or even the assumptions or advice that you have for social validation of many of these things? Because the adoption curves which we normally use in technical systems is basically an extrapolation logic which is not rooted in reality. In fact, most estimates go wrong because people actually don't adopt that soon. So the third one is also on maybe some comments on regulation or the lack of it. What are your thoughts? So as a social scientist, what will be your advice to people who operate IoT as a business?
In response to your first question, I think engineering design firms or technology firms, I think need to go out and collect information in the right way. Oftentimes they work on the basis of intuition, or rather an intuitive construct of what is more efficient than something else. It's not so hard to go out into the real world, pick up a sample of potential users and run a simple experiment. And by an experiment, I mean you randomize, you divide them into a treatment group and a control group, uh, do your intervention, your technological intervention, and then collect information on the outcome variables and see if the adoption is high, if the levels of satisfaction are high, and so on and so forth. That would be, I think, extremely useful, and that can save a lot of heartburn down the road. Marketing firms are pretty good at it, but they typically collect observational data. I mean, this is vast quantities of data, a lot of rows in your data set, a lot of columns, but there is still the problem of establishing causation. Running experiments, behavioral experiments, would be a really, really good way of getting into the market. So that's the advice that I would give to a lot of, not merely IoT companies, but technology companies. That's the, remind me the second question.
On the so social validation you covered, regulation, you have anything on policy side you would like to make a comment?
So policy side is going to be much harder. I mean, so there are bigger questions. I mean, in terms of access and so on. Are we creating a society which then becomes available, where resources then become available only to those who already are privileged? What happens to those who have fallen out of the domains of privilege? Those are bigger questions. Um, in one sense, I think I mean, you can attempt to make the benefits of this technology available to even those who haven't invested in this technology by tweaking around with the norms, or rather with the institutions of intellectual property. intellectual property is, and I'm not speaking here as a rabid leftist or anything. I'm talking about it from the point of view of Chicago School economics. There is ample evidence to demonstrate that IP actually distorts competition and may impact innovation in a negative manner. Uh, if you can tweak around your norms of intellectual property and make the benefits of this technology available to those who can't otherwise afford it, those who are not privileged, I think would be the way to go forward. I think the government needs to look at this.
As it is often debated in decision systems, you actually take your decision with your heart, but just explain it with your mind. So I think that's how we normally behave. I think the question which is maybe a little more societal is because it is all device centric or machine centric, are we getting into a Puritan societies where you have a binary classifier, societies which need only devices and they are very comfortable with it and gets automated, and there are other societies which don't use any devices? It's very ironical that the people in the rise of fast food resulted in slow food movement, right? The rise of styluses which you use on iPad, people still buy fountain pens because your senses are analog, not digital. The high end of any faculty in fine arts is analog. I always say I never order tea in a 5-star because I don't want to pay them to do all the work myself. So I don't know how much time I have. We have some time for questions? I can't see the time. Okay, I think we'll open it to audience.
Hi, my name is Ravi Kant. I have a question. If we track all the shopping carts and they're never stolen, what happens to the homeless?
If
If we track all the shopping carts which are used in large shopping malls, and they were never stolen, what happens to the homeless?
what happened? So your assumption is that shopping carts are used by homeless people to store their goods and so on. Great question. I don't have an answer to that. It's a great question. Sadly, I don't have an answer to that question. Maybe the government has abdicated its responsibility of finding homes for the homeless, and that's where the responsibility should be laid. But is it the responsibility of shopping malls to provide the infrastructure for them to store their belongings? Is a question that begs some attention. Yeah. But you're right. I do empathize with the homeless who will be left without a place to keep their meager little things if shopping carts vanish. I thoroughly empathize with that. Yes. Yes.
Change which has gone in my mind after I watched later 2049, and that's where those were when he produced it, the human model. He's 21-year-old and he decides this is not what I want to give. But how does that relate to the IoT? Is that when I see now IoT and I see the 3D printing, and I'm beginning to realize that this fiction is when I can see the point A to point B. In the past fictions were like there was always a gap out of that. And I look at identity its potential, speed is going. And this, what is your view? I mean, I was quite disturbed watching that.
I don't know enough about Blade Runner, but if I understood your question correctly, what are you trying to talk about? How we?
This fiction movie which talks about what I mean, like the part which was in 1980,
Right.
2019.
Right.
And a lot of things was said probably didn't happen.
Right.
And at that time, it was visualized.
Right.
The computer produced human.
Right.
Now, I mean, lot of underpinning the likes of IoT and AI.
Right.
You can see that. So my question is something like that. I'm sorry.
No, I wish to reiterate my earlier point, and that is, let's not lose the human in the way we construct our world going forward. And I say this not merely from the point of view of the intrinsic value of preserving the human, but I think it makes great business sense. If you lose out the human, adaptability of your technology, you're not going to sell your technology. And unless you understand the rationality, the rational preferences, the systematic biases that go into human decision making, you're not going to create a technology that's going to be adopted, right? I mean, a lot of technology seems to get adopted by trial and error. Companies come forward and create this landscape of wonderful things. Some fall through the cracks, some survive. There seems to be some kind of an evolutionary selection of great ideas. But you can do your homework in advance, ex ante, and try and see if the technology that you're producing is actually something that's going to be adopted or not before you invest your money in it. And that's something that I think is missing at the design stage of technology.
No, I agree with you. That's what we understood.
Right.
Now, the fact that it happened, I mean, while you were talking,
Right.
some of the words you used are was doing, Google is checking what they mean or what has happened. And in that process, which I would have done when I grew up attending classes, I would look at the professor,
Correct.
look at his body language. I probably would recognize it because I was only listening to one or two sentences.
Correct.
So I'm saying that this is happening. Now, what do you say how the human would become? If this can, because can you stop it? I'm not sure. What is your view?
I mean, you can't stop it in at least in those areas where it doesn't make sense, right? I mean, let me give you an example. I teach. I've been teaching at IIM Ahmedabad and so on. Every time I made a PowerPoint presentation, I would lose my class. But if I were to use a much more primitive technology, information technology, which is use the green board and the chalk piece, especially in teaching a quantitative subject, I would find a far greater traction among my students. So I think use appropriate technology rather than be taken in by the fetish for a certain advance merely because it's wonderful from the point of view of pure utilitarian efficiency. Utilitarian efficiency is not sufficient to drive a technology market. You've got to factor in human irrationality. Unless you do that, it's not going to work.
I guess we are out of time. So hopefully we gave you some food for thought so that you can have the real food after this. Thank you.
I think those were cautionary words about a technocratic society. Efficiency is not the only criteria. I think there is something else which needs to come in our technocratic thinking. Can I have Thanks a lot I would like to say with that, we close this session. After lunch, which will, you can join lunch, it's on. At 12:20, we will start the session on e-mobility, etc. I would encourage you to come back for the award session, which will start at 5, where we are talking about how to scale. We have the Minister, Mr. Kharge, coming in, and the government of Karnataka has been doing a great job. And then we have some fantastic startups and emerging technologies which we want to showcase. We would like you to be around and encourage them. So please have lunch. 2:20, we are back here for mobility and sessions. And then at 5, we start the award session. Look forward for you.